Caprio's gavel came down, one sharp final strike. This court finds that the First Union Bank lacks the legal authority to foreclose on the property in question. The eviction is overturned. Judgment for the defendant. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the room erupted. Reporters stood from their chairs, microphones already extended. Spectators gasped. A woman in the back wiped a tear. The bailiff's call for order was lost under the wave of noise. Flashbulbs popped like summer lightning. Jeremy didn't move. He stood there, breathing in through his nose, trying to steady the storm inside. His hands shook, not from fear now, but from everything that had led to this moment. Every night he'd slept in that house, unsure if it would be the last. Every letter from the bank, every ignored call, every locked door. A bailiff approached, speaking gently. "You can step down now." Jeremy nodded, though it felt distant, like he wasn't quite in his body. As he turned from the bench, his eyes met Judge Caprio's. The judge held his gaze for a beat longer than expected, then offered a subtle nod. It wasn't a victory, not fully, but it was an acknowledgement. Outside the courthouse, the winter wind cut hard across the steps. Jeremy squinted into the blur of microphones and flashing bulbs. Reporters shouted questions he couldn't process. He caught fragments. "How did you do it? Who helped you? Did you really write your own motions?" Naya was there, waiting beyond the press line. Her coat pulled tight, worry etched into every line of her face. He broke through the noise and fell into her arms, the weight of it all spilling out in one long exhale. "You did it," she whispered, holding his face in her hands. "You really did it." But Jeremy didn't answer. His eyes were on the crowd, the cameras, the noise. He felt it already. The shift. This wasn't just his story anymore. It had become something larger. The bank would appeal. They always did. He hadn't beaten them, not yet. He'd won a reprieve, a crack in the wall. He had won, but how? How had a young black man, with no legal degree, no money, no backing, dismantled a corporate machine in open court? Stay with us to discover what happened next. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story. Back inside, Judge Caprio remained seated on the bench long after the courtroom had emptied. He watched the empty seats, the abandoned folders, the echoes of outrage and hope that still lingered like dust in the air. He reached for his glasses, setting them down with care. This case, it hadn't just been about property. It had been about power and dignity, and whether the law could still recognize either when tested. He rubbed his eyes slowly, then stood. The hallway outside was quiet now, but the questions followed him home. How had the boy done it? Where had he learned the language of the law, the patience for procedure? What fueled someone with so little to lose and even less to prove? Jeremy Diesel, a name Judge Caprio would not forget. The gavel had fallen. But deep down, he knew the real story was just beginning. It had started with a sound Jeremy Diesel would never forget. A knock. Sharp. Official. Final. He opened the door that morning to find a uniformed man holding an envelope. No expression on his face, just a clipped nod, before he turned and walked back to his car. The envelope was thick. White. The stamp across the front screamed in red. Final notice. Jeremy stood on the porch for a long moment, the morning sun rising behind him, painting the quiet street in gold. The houses looked the same as they always had. Leaning fences, porches sagging under years of use, the distant hum of a lawnmower 2 blocks down. Nothing looked different. And yet, everything had changed. He stepped inside. The house still smelled like her, lavender and something fried. His mother had passed just 3 months earlier. Cancer, quick and cruel. She died believing the home she'd fought so hard for was safe, paid off, free. It was the only thing she had ever truly owned, and she'd made Jeremy promise to keep it. But the paper in his hand said otherwise. He walked through the narrow hallway, past framed photos, the one of her in her church dress, another with her hands in dough at the kitchen counter. The silence felt louder than it should. Jeremy dropped the notice on the table and pulled open the old metal filing cabinet she had kept in the dining room corner. The drawers still creaked. Folder after folder. Tax records, utility bills, handwritten notes in her neat cursive. Then he found it. A document he didn't recognize. Second mortgage agreement. The name was hers, the signature at the bottom too. But something was wrong. The slope of the letters, the way the L in Ella Diesel leaned too far forward. The ink is too thick. His mother's hand had never trembled like that, even at her sickest. Jeremy stared at the page. A cold, hollow weight settled in his stomach. That afternoon, he sat on hold with First Union Bank for 32 minutes. The voice on the line, when it finally arrived, was clipped and indifferent. Foreclosure department. Jeremy cleared his throat. This is Jeremy Diesel. I'm calling about an eviction notice sent for Ella Diesel's home. There must be a mistake. She paid off her mortgage. I have the deed. A pause. There's a default on a second mortgage taken out 2 years ago. Foreclosure proceedings are final. She didn't take out another mortgage, Jeremy said. That signature, it's not right. Something's wrong. Sir, I can't discuss this further. You can file a dispute with our legal department, but it won't delay the eviction. Click. The line went dead. For the next 3 days, Jeremy didn't sleep much. He took the bus downtown, visited legal aid clinics, knocked on office doors. At one firm, a receptionist didn't even look up when she handed back his papers. At another, a young man in a suit glanced at the file and said, "We're not taking cases we can't win." Every no hit a little harder. A man like Jeremy, young, black, broke, unemployed, wasn't supposed to stand in a courtroom. Not unless he was wearing an orange jumpsuit. Who would believe he could take on a bank? Even he wasn't sure anymore. That night, he sat on the front steps of the house. The porch light buzzed softly. A half-drunk soda warmed beside him. Across the street, an old couple watered their lawn. He wondered how many times his mother had sat right here, staring into the dusk, praying bills into balance. The folder sat beside him. He opened it. Pages of scanned copies. Notes scribbled in the margins, circled dates, questions with no answers. Jeremy looked up at the night sky. Then he whispered it, soft, but steady. If no one's coming to help me, I'll learn how to fight myself. It didn't sound brave. It sounded tired. But it was the first decision that truly mattered. The first step of something bigger than he understood. And from that moment on, Jeremy Diesel, unemployed, grieving, alone, was no longer just a young man trying to save a house. The courtroom was nearly empty that morning. Just a few routine hearings, the usual shuffle of low-level disputes and requests. No cameras, no reporters, only the cold draft slipping through the marble columns and the echo of footfalls that never quite disappeared. Jeremy Diesel stood alone before the bench, shoulders square, folder in hand. He didn't wear a suit, just a dark sweater, pressed jeans, and the same quiet resolve he had carried through the doors like a badge. His breath was steady, but his fingers fidgeted at the edges of the motion he'd prepared. Judge Frank Caprio leaned slightly forward, reading the paperwork. His brow furrowed. "This is a motion to stay eviction," Caprio said evenly, glancing over the top of his glasses. "Filed without legal representation." "Yes, Your Honor," Jeremy answered, voice clear but low. "I wasn't able to secure counsel in time, but I believe the foreclosure was wrongful." Caprio paused. His gavel rested quietly beside him. "No attorney at all?" he asked, his tone edged with something between concern and weariness. Jeremy shook his head. "I don't have money for a lawyer. I only have the truth. I'm just asking for a fair shot." Caprio studied with him. The courtroom was still, save for the rustle of the clerk's papers. "You're asking this court to halt a legal foreclosure process," Caprio said. "That's no small ask." Jeremy took a breath. "I understand. But if I walk away now, they'll take my grandmother's house. She raised me there. She died believing it was paid off." Caprio looked down at the file again, thumbing through the attached exhibits. Mortgage documents, deeds, notices. And then something caught his eye, just a flicker of doubt, a stutter in the ink, a signature. Ella Diesel. Her name appeared twice. once in a firm, practiced hand, and again, weeks later, shakier, the loops oddly slanted, uneven, as if written by someone imitating the original or someone whose hand no longer worked the same. Caprio held the 2 pages side by side. His fingers hesitated. He didn't say anything, not yet.
The court finds that the documentation provided is insufficient to support the claim of fraud, he said at last.
His voice was firm but not unkind. The motion to stay is denied. There was a beat of silence. Jeremy didn't argue, didn't plead. He just nodded once, picked up his folder, and left the way he came, in silence. Caprio watched him go. That evening, the judge returned home later than usual. The house was quiet. The kind of quiet that crept in once the world had stopped knocking. He slipped off his coat, loosened his tie, and set his briefcase down beside the radiator. In the corner of the living room, above the old upright piano no one had touched in years, hung a framed photograph, black and white. A boy with slicked back hair crouched beside a man with rough hands and a shoeshine box. Frank and his father. Providence, 1953. He stepped closer, looked at the face of the boy, the eyes. There was something of Jeremy Diesel in that boy, that same mix of pride and fear, hope and exhaustion. He had seen it this morning, not just in the way Jeremy spoke, but in the way he stood, the way he refused to be bowed. Caprio sat down at the kitchen table and opened the file again. The paper crackled softly in the quiet. He stared at the signature. The inconsistency gnawed at him. Not enough to justify reversing a decision, but enough to leave a mark. It wasn't just the slant or the shape. It was the feeling that someone, somewhere, had tried to be clever, and maybe thought no one would notice. His hand hovered over the page. He placed 2 fingers on the second signature, slowly tracing the curve of each letter. Then he closed the file gently, as if something fragile lived inside it. He didn't say it aloud, but he felt it. A crack had formed. Jeremy stood outside the 4th law office that week, his knuckles still tingling from knocking. The receptionist hadn't even looked up. The attorney, a gray-haired man in suspenders and silence, had skimmed his file for less than a minute before sliding it back across the table. "You won't win this," he'd said without cruelty, just certainty, the kind that leaves no room for hope. He tried again, and again. Legal aid clinics, civil rights centers, community organizations. Doors opened, eyes narrowed, hands folded, heads shook. Always the same words. "We're sorry. Too risky. Too big. You're on your own." By the end of the week, Jeremy had stopped introducing himself. He'd walk in, place the folder down, and wait. The answer came before the words did. Polite refusals, tired eyes. One woman didn't even look up from her screen. "There's no case here," she said flatly. There was. He knew there was. But knowing didn't matter. That Friday, he lost his job at the auto shop. "Too much attention," his boss mumbled, avoiding his eyes. "We don't want any trouble." The next morning, a notice slid under his apartment door. Rent overdue. Final warning. By evening, he was back at the library, the same corner table near the window, the same flickering bulb overhead. His hands shook slightly from hunger, but he ignored it. He had bigger problems than food. The book in front of him was thick, bound in black. State foreclosure code. He turned pages slowly, lips moving in a whisper as he read each paragraph twice. Sometimes 3 times. He underlined words with a borrowed pen, made notes on torn receipts. When he ran out of paper, he wrote along the edges of old grocery lists. His back ached, his eyes stung, but he kept going. Because this wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about not being erased. Across town, Judge Frank Caprio sat in a quiet restaurant with his younger brother, Dominic. The place hadn't changed in years. Heavy linen tablecloths, the same warm mahogany panels along the walls, Sinatra crooning softly from the speakers overhead. A familiar comfort in a world that rarely slowed down. Dominic, always more animated of the two, was swirling his wine, grinning. "You know what I've been thinking about, Frankie?" he said, leaning in like it was a secret. You and me, retired, sitting on a boat somewhere off Cape Cod, cold beer in hand, arguing over who gets the first cast. Caprio smiled faintly, lifting his glass. You never win those arguments. True, Dominic chuckled. But retirement's got a funny way of making old men generous. You might finally let me win. Caprio took a sip, eyes fixed on the candle's flicker. I've been thinking about it, you know. Slowing down, getting out of the courtroom. You? Dominic raised an eyebrow. Come on. You've said that every year since the Cubs last won anything. And every time someone walks into your courtroom and you end up staying another year. Caprio let the joke land without argument. He knew his brother was right. Still, the idea of a quieter life had its pull, until the world reminded him it wasn't ready to be quiet. Dominic unfolded his newspaper, scanning the front page. Huh, he muttered, halfway through a bite of steak. This name sounds familiar. Jeremy Diesel? Ring a bell? He turned the paper toward Caprio. There it was. Grainy courtroom photo, bold headline. Local man battles bank alone, wins first round. Caprio's hand paused in midair, fork resting against the plate. Frankie, Dominic said, narrowing his eyes playfully. That's your courtroom, isn't it? Caprio gave the smallest of nods. Dominic leaned back, crossing his arms with a grin. So that's what's really going on. Here I thought you were ready for fishing trips and retirement homes. But no, you've got kids like this walking into your court, and suddenly you're 20 years younger. Caprio set down his fork. Dominic chuckled. You're not fooling me, brother. You might dream of rest, but as long as this world keeps handing out injustice, you'll keep showing up in that robe. You don't know how to let go. Caprio smiled faintly, his eyes still on the photo. I don't think the world's going to stop needing justice anytime soon. Dominic raised his glass. Then I guess I'll have to go fishing without you. Caprio clinked it softly. You always did catch better fish anyway. They laughed. But when the laughter faded, Caprio's gaze lingered on the newspaper, his smile gone, replaced by something quieter, something unsettled. And later that night, alone in his study, it was Jeremy's name that stayed with him. Caprio stood in front of his filing cabinet longer than usual. He opened the drawer marked Civil, closed, and flipped through until he found it. The folder. Diesel v. First Union Bank. He carried it to the desk, turned on the lamp, and sat down. At first, he only meant to skim, but as the minutes passed, his eyes slowed. He read every line, every scanned document, every note. The language of the bank's filings was clean, efficient, too efficient. Jeremy's motion, by contrast, was clumsy in parts, but it held something raw, real. It didn't read like a legal argument. It read like a man trying not to drown. Caprio leaned back. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. The room felt warmer than before. Something about this case, about this kid, was off. Not wrong, not false, just unfinished. Like a book with too many pages missing between chapters. He looked again at the photo in the paper, at the eyes. There was something there he couldn't quite name. Defiance, maybe, or desperation dressed as determination. He closed the folder, but the weight of it stayed in his hands. That night, Judge Frank Caprio did something he hadn't done in years. He left the hallway light on and didn't sleep. The hallway outside apartment 3B smelled faintly of old carpet and boiled cabbage. Jeremy stood there, fingers curled into a soft knock, waiting for an answer he wasn't sure would come. He had driven across the city, through neighborhoods that blurred in the gray morning light, with a single name and a photocopied notary stamp circled in red ink. Denise Fowler. He knocked again, softer this time. After a moment, the door opened a crack. A woman in her 60s peered out, her eyes sharp but wary. She wore a housecoat and clutched the edge of the door like it might swing open too far and reveal something she wasn't ready to show. Yes? Her voice was small, cautious. Ms. Fowler, Jeremy said gently, holding up the document. My name is Jeremy Diesel. I'm here about this. Her eyes flicked to the paper. She didn't take it. She didn't have to. She'd seen it before. I can't talk about that, she said quickly, starting to close the door. I'm not here to cause trouble, Jeremy replied, his voice calm. I'm here because that stamp, the one with your name, cost my family our home. She paused, just long enough for him to add, Please, I'm not asking you to lie. I'm asking you to tell me what really happened. A long silence followed. Then, without a word, she opened the door wider and stepped back. Inside, the apartment was clean but tired. Everything looked like it had been bought on sale and kept in good condition out of respect, not love. Jeremy sat on the edge of a low armchair while Denise poured 2 cups of tea, her hands trembling just enough to rattle the spoons. I was working for a mobile notary service back then, she said finally, settling across from him. They'd call, say a rep would drop off documents. Most times it was routine. Jeremy nodded slowly, letting her go at her own pace. That day, a man came in a suit, said the homeowner was sick, said she couldn't come in but had already signed. All I had to do was notarize. Just a formality, he said. She took a sip, her eyes fixed on the steam rising from her cup. I didn't know your grandmother, she whispered. I didn't see her sign, but I stamped it anyway. Jeremy said nothing. He looked down at the page in his lap, the same page he'd stared at 100 nights alone. Why? He asked softly. Her lips tightened. Because I was tired. Because I didn't think it mattered. Because I didn't want to lose the contract. You pick the reason, it's all the same. I made a choice, a small one, and it cost you everything. Jeremy looked up. Her eyes met his, glassy but unflinching. I'm sorry, she said. I'll testify if you need me to. He nodded once, slowly. I do. Across town, Judge Frank Caprio sat behind his desk, the late afternoon sun pouring through the half-drawn blinds, casting stripes of light and shadow across the thick folders stacked before him. Bring me the updated witness list, he had told his clerk earlier. Now, he scanned the newly filed affidavit from Denise Fowler. The lines were brief, clear. Admitting she had notarized a mortgage agreement without witnessing the signature. Admitting she had done so under pressure. Caprio didn't blink. He read it twice. Then, very slowly, he stood. The soft yellow light from the banker's lamp touched the lines around his eyes, his brow furrowed in thought. For weeks he had wondered, weighed, considered the angles. But doubt had been replaced with certainty now. He whispered the words, barely audible even to himself. They lied. He looked out the narrow window at the city below. It was still moving, still pulsing with its routine rhythm. But in this room, something had shifted. A line had been crossed. A seal had been placed on a lie, and that lie had stolen a home. Frank Caprio had spent a lifetime inside the law. He had seen loopholes turned into weapons, but this wasn't strategy. This was betrayal, and it demanded more than careful reading. It demanded truth, but not yet, not fully, not without something even the most skilled liars couldn't twist. A fact so undeniable it would survive the courtroom and the headlines both. He turned back to the desk. His hand rested gently on the folder. Tomorrow, he would call for records the bank hoped were forgotten. Tomorrow, he would ask questions out loud. But tonight, in the quiet of chambers that had seen too much and spoken too little, Judge Frank Caprio made a decision he didn't write down. He would find that final proof. It started with a quiet buzz. Jeremy's phone lit up on the motel nightstand just after 2 a.m. A notification from his banking app. He blinked at the screen, groggy, then sat up straight. Account access denied. Suspicious activity. Funds frozen. By morning, the motel manager was knocking. No payment, no room. Jeremy stood in the doorway with the same folder he'd carried into court, now heavier with new pages, but no longer enough to buy him a bed. The retaliation had begun. By noon, he was back on the street, the chill of the Chicago wind slicing through his coat. He walked to the community center where he'd taken shifts as a night janitor. But when he swiped his badge, the light stayed red. The door stayed locked. A printed note hung inside the glass. Due to external pressures, we are restructuring staff. He stood there, hands shoved deep into his pockets, heart pounding. It wasn't a coincidence. That afternoon, Nia called. Her voice was tight, scared.
Jeremy, 2 guys in suits were parked outside my building, just sitting there. I went out to ask what they wanted. They didn't answer, just stared. Jeremy closed his eyes. I'm sorry. She hesitated. This fight, it's not just yours anymore. By nightfall, he had found a corner in the library lobby to sleep in. Not a real bed, but warm. At least no one asked him to leave. He sat with his back against the vending machine, knees drawn to his chest, the folder in his lap. It wasn't just about the house anymore. They were trying to erase him. Across town, Denise Fowler sat frozen at her desk. The notary who had admitted her mistake. The one who had sworn to testify. That morning, her supervisor had pulled her aside. We need to talk, he'd said. Upper management doesn't like that your name's coming up in court records. You should consider stepping away for a while quietly. It wasn't a threat, not directly, but the meaning was clear. Then came the knock at Jeremy's window. He jerked awake. The library was closed. The hallway dim. Standing outside in the shadows was a woman he didn't recognize. Late 20s. Hood pulled low. She tapped the glass again, then held up a manila envelope. He opened the door cautiously. Jeremy Diesel? He nodded. Name's Emily Ortiz. I used to be a paralegal at First Union. I saw your name in the court filings. I need to talk. Inside the library vestibule, under the dim emergency light, she laid out the truth. I left 2 months ago. Couldn't stomach it anymore. We were told to prioritize evictions in minority neighborhoods. Less legal resistance, they said. Less media attention. I kept copies. She handed him the envelope. Inside were printed emails, internal memos. One stood out. Subject line, high-risk zones expedite process. The body said it all. Streamline filings in designated areas to reduce litigation delays. Focus, South and West Side, minority ownership properties prioritized. Jeremy stared at the page, numb. Why are you giving me this? Emily's eyes were tired. Because if you lose, everyone loses. 2 days later, the copy of one of those emails appeared on Judge Caprio's desk. No name, no envelope, just there, slipped between legal memos. He pulled it free and read it slowly. At first, his brow furrowed. Then it softened. Then, something in his eyes shifted. He remembered a day in 1964. He was 12. His mother, Maria Caprio, came home from the bank in tears. She'd been denied a small loan to fix the roof. They said we don't qualify, she had whispered, holding the denial letter. But we've been here 20 years. We pay every bill. She didn't need to say why. The name Caprio was enough. He looked again at the words on the page. Focus, minority ownership properties. The language had changed. The heart of it hadn't. That afternoon, Judge Caprio summoned his senior clerks and legal aides. The room was quiet as they filed in, faces cautious. He held the email in his hand. If we reopen this case, one aide warned, you'll face pressure. Political, institutional. You'll be accused of bias. Caprio nodded slowly. I know. A long pause. Then he stood. If this court does not stand with those who have nothing, no firm, no funds, no name, then it's not a courthouse anymore. It's just a prettier version of the bank's lobby. And with that, he set the wheels in motion. The courtroom had not changed much over the years. Same wooden benches, worn soft by time. Same high windows letting in slivers of Chicago light. Same distant echo in the air like the inside of a cathedral. But that morning, everything felt different to Judge Frank Caprio.
From the bench, he watched Jeremy Diesel stand up for the last time. No lawyer by his side, no tie, no polished briefcase. Just a young man in a clean shirt, holding the weight of a house, a neighborhood, and a promise in his hands. Caprio had seen hundreds like him before, or so he thought. But something had shifted. It wasn't in Jeremy's voice, which remained steady. It wasn't in the arguments, which were sharp, but never desperate. It was in the way Jeremy stood, not like someone begging the court for help, like someone standing where someone else used to stand. His mother, or maybe his grandmother. That thought clung to Caprio as Denise Fowler took the stand. She was nervous at first, hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the microphone. "I didn't witness the signature," she said. "I was told she was too ill to come in. They said it was just a formality." Jeremy didn't flinch. He just looked down, as if the words weren't surprising, just sad. Then came Rachel, the quiet paralegal who hadn't been part of the case until 2 days earlier. She walked in with a folder and a purpose. "These emails," she said, handing copies to the court clerk, "show internal discussion between bank officials about expediting foreclosure filings. One message refers to the Diesel case as a clean win, even before a hearing was scheduled." Caprio scanned the printed emails slowly. The lines were cold, calculated, not illegal perhaps, but inhuman. The bank's attorney stood, his voice rising just slightly. "Your Honor, none of this proves fraud. These are procedural errors at best." Caprio didn't reply. He turned to the bank's lead counsel. "Do you have the original loan documents?" The attorney hesitated. "We're still in the process of..." "So, no?" "No, Your Honor." Caprio nodded. Just once, quietly. He sat back in his chair, the creak of old leather the only sound in the room. All eyes were on him, but he wasn't looking at anyone. He stared at the bench in front of him as though something had been left there, something no one else could see. A shoebox. That's what his father had once kept under the bed. Inside, every rent receipt, every utility bill, a copy of the lease. A man with no education but deep mistrust of the system. Caprio hadn't thought of that shoebox in years, but now it came back, along with the weight of what it meant to keep records not for pride, but for protection. He reached for the gavel. "Hold it a second longer than usual." "The court finds," he said quietly, "that First Union Bank lacks the legal right to foreclose on the Diesel property." The gavel came down, and the courtroom shattered. Gasps, cheers, reporters scrambling. Jeremy didn't move at first. Then he exhaled, like he'd been holding his breath for weeks. He looked up at Caprio. Their eyes met only for a moment. Caprio stood. Without a word, he turned and stepped off the bench, disappearing through the side door while the crowd rushed toward the front. In his chambers, the light was softer. Dust floated gently in the air. The noise from the courtroom faded into a distant hum. He walked to the window and looked out at the city below. People moving. Lives continue. He should have felt satisfied. He should have felt something like relief, but all he felt was stillness. For years, he had followed the law. Every ruling, every sentence, every line written in the books. But this case had asked him for something more. It had asked him to listen, not just to arguments, but to silence, to absence, to the space a mother leaves behind in a house. And for the first time in a long while, he felt he had done more than follow the law. He had honored it. Not the cold ink on paper, but the living spirit of it. Outside, the crowd still buzzed. Inside, Caprio leaned against the window frame, eyes half closed. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. And that's where we leave today's story, inside a quiet chamber, with Judge Caprio standing alone, not as a man of the system, but as a man who chose to see beyond it. Jeremy Diesel didn't just win a case. He reminded us what justice can look like when someone refuses to give up, even when the odds say they should. If this story moved you, If you believe in the power of truth spoken by those without power, then don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And let us know in the comments, what would you have done if you were in Judge Caprio's shoes? We've got more real, emotional, and powerful stories just like this one coming up. So, stay close, stay curious, and as always, thank you for watching.